My name is Rachel Martinez. I am a certified financial analyst with 12 years of experience tracking corporate fraud for Colorado's largest investment firm. But to my ex-husband David, his family, and his high-powered legal team, I was just another woman who didn't understand how the real world worked. To them, I was the naive girl from Fort Collins who should be grateful for the life they'd given me, the one who should walk away quietly when the marriage ended and take whatever scraps they offered. They thought I was weak, predictable, someone they could manipulate and discard without consequence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember sitting in that sterile conference room at Chen Associates, watching David's lawyer slide the divorce settlement across the mahogany table. The papers were thick, intimidating, filled with legal jargon designed to confuse and overwhelm. David sat back in his leather chair, arms crossed, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The same expression he wore when he thought he'd outsmarted someone. His mother, Victoria, sat beside him in her Chanel suit, her diamond rings catching the light as she folded her manicured hands. She hadn't spoken a word to me, hadn't even acknowledged my presence. The settlement was insulting. After 8 years of marriage, they were offering me $15,000 and 30 days to vacate the house. No alimony, no share of David's business, no recognition of the contributions I'd made to building his career. Just enough money to rent a studio apartment and start over with nothing. David's attorney, a sharp-faced man named Harrison, spoke to me like I was a child. "This is a generous offer, Mrs. Chen. Given the circumstances, I'd advise you to sign quickly before they reconsider." The circumstances? That was their code word for the narrative they'd carefully constructed. The story of a marriage that failed because I couldn't adapt to their world, couldn't handle the pressures of being married to a successful man. They painted me as unstable, demanding, someone who'd become increasingly difficult as David's career flourished. None of it was true, but truth had never mattered much to the Chen family. What mattered was control, appearances, and making sure they came out ahead. I looked across the table at the man I'd loved for 10 years, the person I'd supported through law school, whose dreams I'd believed in when he was just another struggling student. His eyes were cold now, calculating. There was no trace of the person who used to hold my hand during scary movies, who'd promised we'd travel the world together, who'd said I was the only person who really understood him. That man was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as an obstacle to be eliminated as efficiently as possible. "I need time to think," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. David laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Think about what, Rachel? This is more than fair. You walked into this marriage with nothing, and you're leaving with something. That's generous in my book." His mother finally spoke, her voice crisp and dismissive. "David's being kind, dear. In most cases like this, the wife would get much less. You should be thankful." That's when I knew for certain what I'd suspected for months. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted me erased, forgotten, reduced to nothing more than a footnote in David's success story. A cautionary tale about what happens when someone from my background tries to climb above their station, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea what I'd discovered. They had no idea that the woman sitting across from them had spent her entire career finding the secrets people tried to hide, following paper trails that others missed, uncovering the truth buried beneath layers of careful deception. And they certainly had no idea that I had a file sitting in my apartment that would bring their entire world crashing down around them. I met David Chen during my junior year at the University of Colorado Boulder. I was studying finance, working 2 part-time jobs to pay for school, living in a cramped apartment I shared with 3 other girls. He was a first-year law student, charming and ambitious, with dreams of building his own practice someday. We met at a coffee shop near campus where I worked the morning shift, serving overpriced lattes to students who looked like they'd never worried about money a day in their lives. David was different from the other privileged kids who came through. He talked to me like I mattered, asked about my classes, remembered my name. When he found out I was studying financial analysis, His eyes lit up with genuine interest. He told me about his plans to specialize in corporate law, how he wanted to help businesses navigate complex financial structure. We talked for hours about market trends, regulatory changes, the intersection of law and finance that fascinated us both. Our courtship was a whirlwind of late-night study sessions, weekend hikes in the Rockies, and conversations that stretched until dawn. David introduced me to a world I'd only seen from the outside: restaurants where the waiters knew wine pairings, art galleries where people spoke in hushed tones about pieces worth more than my parents' house. I was dazzled by it all. But more than that, I was dazzled by him. He made me feel like I belonged in that world, like I was sophisticated and intelligent enough to be his partner in the life he was building. When he took me home to meet his family during Christmas break of my senior year, I should have seen the warning sign. The Chen family lived in a sprawling modern home in Cherry Creek, all glass and steel and carefully curated art. Victoria Chen greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes, the kind of polite mask wealthy people wear when they're forced to interact with someone beneath their social station. David's father, Robert, was warmer but distant, more interested in discussing business deals than getting to know his son's girlfriend. Throughout the weekend, I felt like I was being evaluated, measured against some invisible standard I couldn't quite grasp. Victoria asked pointed questions about my family, my background, my plans after graduation. When I mentioned that my parents were both retired teachers, I caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before she moved the conversation along. At dinner, she made casual comments about the right kind of people, the importance of marrying within one's social circle, the challenges that arose when couples came from different worlds. David seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, or maybe he chose to ignore them. He was focused on his studies, on building relationships with professors who could help his career, on positioning himself for the best opportunities after graduation. I supported him completely, often sacrificing my own social life to help him study, proofreading his papers, managing his schedule so he could focus on academics. I told myself that was what partners did for each other, that my contributions mattered even if they weren't always acknowledged. After graduation, David was accepted into a prestigious corporate law program in Denver. I found a position at Colorado Financial Group, a mid-sized investment firm that specialized in due diligence for corporate acquisitions. My starting salary was modest, but I was good at the work. I had an intuitive understanding of financial patterns, a talent for spotting inconsistencies that others missed. Within 2 years, I was promoted to senior analyst, handling increasingly complex cases. David proposed on a Friday night in March, exactly 4 years after we'd met. We were at the same coffee shop where we'd first talked, and he got down on one knee beside the table where I used to study between shifts. The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire that must have cost months of his starting salary. I said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down my face, convinced I was the luckiest woman in the world. The wedding planning revealed more about the Chen family dynamics than our entire courtship. Victoria took control immediately, hiring vendors, selecting venues, making decisions about everything from flowers to music to guest lists. When I tried to contribute ideas, she would listen politely and then proceed with her original plans. My opinions were acknowledged but never implemented. My parents, humble and kind, were quietly overwhelmed by the scale and expense of everything. They offered to contribute what they could, but Victoria waved away their suggestions with a gracious smile that somehow felt like a slap. The wedding itself was perfect in every detail, a showcase of Chen family taste and resources. I felt like a beautiful accessory, carefully chosen to complement the overall aesthetic. The reception was held at the Denver Country Club, with 200 guests I'd barely met, eating food that cost more per plate than my parents spent on groceries in a month. During our first dance, David whispered in my ear that this was just the beginning, that we were going to build something amazing together. I believed him completely. The first few years of marriage felt like an extension of our courtship. We lived in a charming townhouse in Lakewood, a wedding gift from David's parents that came with the understanding that it remained in the Chen family trust. David's career progressed rapidly. He joined a prestigious firm downtown, specialized in mergers and acquisitions, built a reputation for handling complex corporate transactions. My own career flourished as well. I developed expertise in forensic accounting, became the person my firm called when they needed someone to dig deep into financial records and uncover hidden problems. But somewhere along the way, things began to shift. David's work demanded longer hours, more travel, more networking events where spouses were expected to be charming but not too prominent. I learned to play the role perfectly, smiling and making small talk with the wives of David's colleagues, discussing safe topics like interior design and charity fundraising while the men talked business. I attended dinners where million-dollar deals were discussed like casual conversation, where the wine cost more than most people's monthly rent. Victoria began inserting herself more into our lives, offering unsolicited advice about everything from my career choices to my wardrobe. She suggested I might want to consider scaling back my work commitments to focus on supporting David's rising profile. She introduced me to personal stylists who could help me develop a more appropriate image for a successful lawyer's wife. She dropped hints about grandchildren, about the importance of maintaining the Chen family legacy. I started to feel like I was disappearing piece by piece. The woman who had worked 2 jobs to pay for college, who had earned promotions through skill and determination, who had dreams and ambitions of her own, was being gradually erased. In her place was emerging someone I didn't recognize, a carefully polished version of myself that existed primarily to enhance David's image. When I tried to talk to David about my concerns, he dismissed them with the same patronizing tone his mother used. I was being too sensitive, too focused on perceived slights. His family loved me, he insisted. They just wanted what was best for us. Besides, his career was demanding enough without having to worry about hurt feelings and misunderstandings at home. The turning point came during our 5th year of marriage. I had been working on a complex case involving a tech startup's acquisition, spending months analyzing their financial records. Something didn't add up in their reported earnings, and I kept digging until I uncovered a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. The company's CFO had been siphoning money through a network of shell companies, hiding millions in losses while presenting a picture of steady growth to potential buyers. My investigation saved my firm's client from a disastrous purchase and earned me recognition throughout the industry. I was excited to share the news with David, to celebrate the successful conclusion of months of painstaking work. When I told him about the case over dinner, he listened with half his attention while scrolling through emails on his phone. When I finished explaining how I'd traced the fraudulent transactions, he looked up briefly and said, "That's nice, honey. Pass the salt." That night, lying in bed beside my husband of 5 years, I realized that I had become invisible in my own life. The woman who could unravel million-dollar fraud schemes was somehow not interesting enough to merit her husband's full attention for 5 minutes. The person whose work had earned respect from corporate executives and federal investigators was treated like a child when she tried to contribute to conversations about business or finance. But I didn't know yet that my invisibility was about to become an advantage. I didn't know that being underestimated would turn out to be the greatest gift David and his family could have given me. Because while they saw me as just another pretty wife who could be managed and controlled, I was watching, learning, and quietly building a picture of their world that they never suspected existed. The first crack in their facade appeared during our 6th year of marriage, when I accidentally discovered that the charming townhouse we lived in wasn't the generous wedding gift I'd believed it to be. I was organizing our financial documents for tax season when I found paperwork showing that David had been paying market-rate rent to his parents' trust the entire time we'd lived there. The gift was actually a business arrangement that allowed the Chen family to maintain control of the property while benefiting from our monthly payments. When I asked David about it, he shrugged off my concern. It was a family arrangement, he explained, a way to keep properties within the trust for tax purposes. I wouldn't understand the complexities of estate planning, but it was all perfectly legitimate. The dismissive tone, the assumption that I was too simple to grasp basic financial concepts stung more than the deception itself. That's when I started paying closer attention to the Chen family's business dealing. Not because I suspected anything criminal, but because I wanted to understand the world I'd married into. I began noticing patterns in their conversations, references to properties and investments, and partnerships that didn't quite align with what I'd been told. I started keeping mental notes, the way I'd been trained to do when analyzing complex financial structures. What I discovered would eventually destroy everything they'd built. But in those early days of my investigation, I was still hoping to find innocent explanations for the discrepancies I was noticing. I was still trying to save my marriage, still believing that love and loyalty could bridge the growing divide between us. I had no idea that David and his family had already decided I was a liability to be eliminated. I had no idea they were planning to discard me the moment it became convenient to do so. And I certainly had no idea that their efforts to destroy me would ultimately lead to their own downfall. Because while they were busy underestimating me, I was doing what I did best. I was following the money, tracing the connections, building a case that would reveal the truth they'd worked so hard to hide. The same skills that had made me successful in my career were about to uncover secrets that would change everything. They thought they knew who they were dealing with. They thought they could control the narrative, manipulate the outcome, ensure that I walked away quietly with nothing. They were wrong about all of it, but that realization was still months away. For now, I was still the devoted wife, still playing the role they'd assigned me, still hoping that somehow we could find our way back to the love that had brought us together. I was still believing in the possibility of happy endings, still trusting that truth and fairness would prevail. I was about to learn how naive that hope really was. The discovery that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I was working from home, analyzing quarterly reports for a pharmaceutical merger, when David burst through the front door 3 hours earlier than usual. His face was flushed, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and there was something wild in his eyes that I'd never seen before. "We need to talk," he said, loosening his tie with shaking hands. "Rachel, we need to talk right now." I closed my laptop and followed him into the living room, where he began pacing back and forth like a caged animal. For a moment I thought something terrible had happened to his parents, or that he'd received devastating news about his career. But when he finally stopped moving and looked at me, I saw something else entirely: guilt, fear, and underneath it all, a coldness that made my stomach clench. "I want a divorce," he said, the words dropping between us like stones into still water. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. We'd had our problems, certainly. The distance between us had grown wider over the years, and I'd felt increasingly isolated in our marriage. But divorce, the word felt foreign, impossible. We'd been together for 10 years, married for 8. We'd built a life together, made plans, promised each other forever. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "David, what are you talking about?" He ran his hands through his hair, avoiding my eyes. "This isn't working, Rachel. It hasn't been working for a long time. We're different people than we were when we got married. We want different things." The explanations that followed were vague, rehearsed sounding. We'd grown apart. Our goals were no longer aligned. He needed space to focus on his career. I was holding him back from opportunities that required a different kind of partnership. The words washed over me like white noise, meaningless corporate speak, designed to avoid saying anything real. But it was what he didn't say that told the real story. He didn't mention love lost or found. He didn't talk about trying counseling or working through our problems. He didn't even seem particularly sad about ending our marriage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He spoke about divorce the way he might discuss terminating a business contract that was no longer profitable. That night, after David had packed a bag and left to stay at his parents' house, I sat alone in our bedroom, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The suddenness of it, the clinical way he'd delivered the news, the complete absence of emotion in his voice, none of it felt like the end of a marriage. It felt like the execution of a plan. I couldn't sleep, so I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden I'd spent 3 years cultivating. As the hours passed, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed began falling into place. David's increasingly frequent business trip, the way he'd started taking phone calls in private, his sudden interest in our financial arrangements, questions about my salary and savings that had seemed casual at the time, but now felt calculated. 3 days later, the divorce papers arrived by courier. The speed of it took my breath away. These weren't documents hastily drawn up after an impulsive decision. They were comprehensive, detailed, clearly the product of weeks or months of preparation. While I'd been struggling to understand what had gone wrong in our marriage, David had been quietly building a legal case to end it. The terms were devastating. David claimed the townhouse as his separate property, citing the complex trust arrangement his family had created. He wanted to keep all of his business assets, his retirement accounts, even the car I'd been driving for 3 years. In exchange, he was offering me $15,000 and 30 days to vacate the property. No spousal support, no recognition of the contributions I'd made to our household or his career. Nothing that acknowledged 8 years of partnership. But it was the character assassination buried in the legal language that truly shocked me. According to David's filing, I had become increasingly unstable and erratic during our marriage. I was described as controlling, demanding, unable to handle the pressures of being married to a successful professional. There were references to my inappropriate behavior at social events, my inability to maintain appropriate boundaries with his family and colleagues. None of it was true, but the allegations were crafted carefully, using incidents taken out of context and twisted beyond recognition. The time I'd questioned a significant expense on our credit card became evidence of my controlling nature. My attempts to participate in conversations about David's work were reframed as inappropriate intrusions into his professional relationships. Even my career success was weaponized against me, portrayed as an obsession that had damaged our marriage. I called David that evening, my hands trembling as I dialed his number. "How could you write these things about me?" I asked when he answered. "David, you know none of this is true." His response was calm, almost bored. "My attorney advised me that these allegations were necessary to protect my interests. It's just legal strategy, Rachel. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally." As if the systematic destruction of my character and reputation was just another business transaction. As if 8 years of marriage could be reduced to legal strategy and calculated lies. That's when I realized that the man I'd loved, the person I'd built my life around, had never really existed. Or perhaps he had existed once, but he'd been gradually replaced by someone who saw relationships as acquisitions to be managed and discarded when they no longer served his purposes. The David who had proposed in that coffee shop, who had promised to love and cherish me, had been consumed by the ambition and coldness that his family had cultivated in him since birth. The meeting with my first attorney was a disaster. Janet Morrison was a pleasant woman in her 50s, who specialized in amicable divorces. She listened to my story with sympathetic nods, made encouraging sounds about fighting for a fair settlement, and then gently explained that David's legal position was quite strong. The trust arrangement that controlled our housing was legally complex, designed by experts to protect family assets. His business interests were legitimately separate property acquired before our marriage. My own career success, ironically, worked against me in the eyes of the court, suggesting I was capable of supporting myself without assistance. "These character allegations are unfortunate," she said, sliding David's filing across her desk. "But they're not uncommon in contested divorces. Your husband's attorney is clearly trying to establish grounds for denying spousal support." When I asked about challenging the allegations about presenting evidence of my actual character and contributions to the marriage, she looked uncomfortable. "We could try, of course, but litigation is expensive, and there's no guarantee of success. The Chen family has significant resources and excellent legal representation. Sometimes the wisest course is to accept a reasonable settlement and move forward with your life." Reasonable settlement. $15,000 for 8 years of marriage, 30 days to rebuild my entire life. No acknowledgement of the woman who had supported David through law school, who had attended countless networking events to help build his career, who had sacrificed her own opportunities to be the perfect corporate wife. I left Morrison's office feeling more defeated than I had since this nightmare began. But as I drove home through the familiar streets of Lakewood, something else began to stir beneath the despair. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly, but something colder and more durable. The kind of anger that comes from being systematically underestimated and dismissed. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I logged into our shared financial accounts and began studying our records with the same analytical eye I brought to my professional work. If David and his family thought they could manipulate the narrative and control the outcome of our divorce, they were about to learn that they'd underestimated exactly the wrong person. What I found in those financial records would have impressed my colleagues at Colorado Financial Group. The Chen family's money management was sophisticated, layered with trusts and shell companies, and investment vehicles designed to obscure the true ownership of assets. But it was also sloppy in ways that suggested they'd never expected anyone with my particular skills to examine their arrangement. David's salary from his law firm was substantial but not extraordinary, yet somehow, he'd been living a lifestyle that required significantly more income. The mortgage payments on a vacation condo in Aspen, regular transfers to investment accounts I'd never known existed, credit card charges for expenses that seemed far beyond what his documented income could support. The deeper I dug, the more questions arose. David claimed the townhouse as his separate property, but the renovation costs from 3 years ago had been paid from our joint account. The car he wanted to keep had been purchased with money I could trace to my own salary. Even some of his business expenses appeared to have been subsidized by household funds that included my contribution. But it was the pattern of transfers between various Chen family accounts that really caught my attention. Money moving in complex circles between David's accounts, his parents' trusts, the law firm where David worked, and several companies I didn't recognize. The amounts were significant, and the timing suggested a level of coordination that went far beyond normal family financial planning. I worked through the night, following digital paper trails the way I'd been trained to do, building spreadsheets and timelines that mapped the flow of money through the Chen family's financial empire. By dawn, I had assembled a picture that was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The family that had always presented itself as old money, quietly wealthy through generations of careful investment, appeared to be running a sophisticated money laundering operation. The revelation was so shocking that I initially doubted my own analysis. These were respectable people, pillars of Denver society, active in charity work and cultural organizations. David's father served on the boards of several nonprofit institutions. His mother was known for her philanthropic activities. The idea that they were criminals seemed absurd, but the numbers didn't lie. Money was flowing into Chen family accounts from sources that made no legitimate sense. Construction companies that existed only on paper, consulting firms with no visible business activity, real estate transactions that involved properties bought and sold within days for dramatically different prices. All of it carefully structured to obscure the original sources of the funds, and David was right in the middle of it. His law firm wasn't just handling routine corporate transactions. They were facilitating the legal framework that made the entire operation possible. The same man who had dismissed me as too simple to understand estate planning was using his legal expertise to help his family launder millions of dollars. I printed out everything, organizing the evidence into neat folders the way I would for any professional investigation. Then I sat back and stared at what I'd uncovered, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The man I'd been married to for 8 years wasn't just ending our relationship. He was a criminal, and his family's entire fortune was built on illegal activities. The smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to pretend I'd never seen any of it. To take David's insulting settlement offer and disappear quietly, the way they expected me to do, to start over somewhere else and try to forget that I'd ever been married to a man whose family fortune came from washing dirty money. But I thought about the character assassination buried in David's divorce filing, the lies designed to destroy my reputation and credibility, the dismissive way his mother had always spoken to me, the assumption that I was too naive and simple to understand the complexities of their work, the years of being treated like an accessory, a pretty decoration whose opinions and contributions didn't matter. They wanted me to disappear quietly. They expected me to be grateful for their generosity in offering me anything at all. They assumed I would be too intimidated by their wealth and legal connections to fight back effectively. They were wrong about all of it, And I was about to prove exactly how wrong they were. Finding the right legal representation took 3 weeks of careful research and quiet inquiry. I couldn't approach this the way I'd approached my first attorney search, asking friends for recommendations, or choosing someone from a standard directory. The Chen family had connections throughout Denver's legal community, and I needed someone who couldn't be influenced or intimidated by their wealth and reputation. Sarah Kim's office was located in a modest building in downtown Denver, far from the gleaming towers where the city's most prestigious law firms maintained their headquarters, but her credentials were impeccable. Harvard Law School, 15 years with the district attorney's office specializing in financial crimes, and a private practice that focused on cases involving complex fraud and money laundering. More importantly, she had a reputation for taking on powerful defendants and winning. Our first meeting was unlike anything I'd experienced with Janet Morrison. Sarah listened to my story without interruption, taking notes in precise handwriting, asking pointed questions about dates and amounts and documentation. When I finished explaining the financial patterns I'd discovered, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Mrs. Chen," she said, and I noticed she didn't try to soften her words or manage my expectations. "What you're describing isn't just divorce fraud. If your analysis is correct, we're talking about federal crimes, money laundering, tax evasion, possibly racketeering depending on the scope of their operations." She explained the implications with clinical precision. A divorce settlement would be the least of David's problems if federal investigators became involved. The Chen family's entire financial empire could be seized under asset forfeiture laws. David could face decades in federal prison. But, she continued, making allegations of this magnitude requires absolute certainty about the evidence. We need documentation that will stand up to scrutiny from federal prosecutors and defense attorneys who specialize in white-collar crime. Your financial analysis is impressive, but it's only the beginning of what we'll need to build a case. That's when she introduced me to James Rodriguez, a former FBI agent with 20 years of experience investigating financial crimes. James had left the bureau to start his own private investigation firm. He specialized in cases involving complex corporate fraud, working with attorneys who needed more than standard legal research to build their cases. James was a compact man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he'd seen every possible variation of human greed and deception. He reviewed my financial analysis with the same methodical attention that Sarah had shown, occasionally making notes or asking questions about specific transactions. "This is sophisticated work," he said finally. "Most people wouldn't have been able to identify these patterns, let alone trace them across multiple entities. You have a natural talent for this kind of investigation." He explained how a proper investigation would proceed. Financial records were just the starting point. They would need to verify the existence and activities of the various companies involved in the money transfers. They would need to identify the original sources of the funds flowing into Chen family accounts. They would need to document the legal mechanisms David's firm had created to facilitate the laundering process. "This isn't going to be quick or cheap," James warned. "A thorough investigation could take months and cost tens of thousands of dollars. And there's always the possibility that we'll discover your initial analysis was wrong, that there are legitimate explanations for the financial patterns you've identified." I thought about the $15,000 David was offering me in the divorce settlement. It would barely cover a month of professional investigation, let alone the comprehensive case we were discussing. But I also thought about the years of being dismissed and underestimated, the character assassination in David's legal filings, the assumption that I would quietly disappear when my usefulness ended. "How much do you need to get started?" I asked. Sarah and James exchanged glances. "We could begin with a preliminary investigation for $15,000, Sarah said. "That would give us enough to verify whether your suspicions are justified and determine if we have grounds for a more comprehensive case." $15,000, exactly the amount David had offered me to walk away quietly. I smiled for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "Consider it done." The investigation that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. James assembled a team that included forensic accountants, computer specialists, and researchers who knew how to trace corporate connections across multiple jurisdictions. I continued working at Colorado Financial Group, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while spending my evenings and weekends helping to unravel the Chen family's financial empire. The first breakthrough came when James's team identified the true ownership structure of several companies that had been sending money to Chen family accounts. What appeared to be legitimate consulting and construction businesses were actually fronts for a drug trafficking organization based in Mexico. The consulting fees and construction payments were actually proceeds from cocaine and heroin sales being laundered through carefully structured business transactions. The second breakthrough was even more significant. David's law firm wasn't just providing legal services to facilitate money laundering, they were active partners in the operation, taking substantial fees for creating the corporate structures and legal documentation that made the laundering possible. David himself had personally handled many of the transactions, using his legal expertise to ensure that the money transfers appeared legitimate to banking regulators. But it was the third discovery that transformed our case from a complex financial investigation into something much larger. The Chen family wasn't just laundering money for one criminal organization, they were operating what amounted to a financial services company for multiple drug trafficking and organized crime groups, providing sophisticated money laundering services to clients across the western United States. The scope of the operation was staggering. Over the past 5 years, James estimated that the Chen family had processed over $50 million in illegal proceeds. They had created dozens of shell companies, purchased properties in multiple states, and established investment accounts that allowed criminal organizations to access their laundered money through seemingly legitimate channels. And David was the architect of much of it. His legal training and family connections had made him the perfect person to design and implement the complex corporate structures that made the entire operation possible. The successful, respected attorney who had grown tired of his naive wife was actually one of Denver's most sophisticated money launderers. As the evidence mounted, Sarah began preparing for what she called the nuclear option. Rather than simply using our discoveries to negotiate a better divorce settlement, we would present everything to federal prosecutors. The investigation had uncovered crimes serious enough to warrant a multi-agency federal task force. The FBI, DEA, and IRS would all have jurisdiction over different aspects of the Chen family's activities. Once we trigger a federal investigation, Sarah explained, everything changes. Your divorce case becomes secondary to criminal proceedings that could take years to resolve. David and his family will face potential prison sentences and the seizure of everything they own. There's no going back from that decision. I thought about the woman I'd been 8 months ago, devoted wife trying to understand why her marriage was failing. That person would have been horrified by the idea of destroying the lives of people she'd once considered family. She would have looked for ways to negotiate, to find compromise solutions that didn't involve federal agents and criminal prosecutions. But that woman had been naive in ways I could no longer afford to be. She had believed that love and loyalty were reciprocal, that treating people with respect and kindness would earn similar treatment in return. She had trusted that the legal system would recognize her contributions and treat her fairly, even if her husband had decided to discard her. I was no longer that woman. The months of investigation had shown me exactly who David and his family really were, and what they were capable of when they decided someone was no longer useful to them. They had tried to destroy my reputation, steal my contributions to our marriage, and erase me from their lives as efficiently as possible. Now I was going to show them what happened when they underestimated exactly the wrong person. Let's do it, I told Sarah. Let's bring everything down. The federal task force was assembled with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of coordination between agencies. Sarah had presented our evidence to the U.S. Attorney's Office on a Monday morning. By Friday afternoon, FBI agents, DEA investigators, and IRS criminal investigators were meeting in a conference room in the federal building downtown, planning what they called Operation Clean House. Agent Michael Torres, the FBI's lead investigator on financial crimes, reviewed our evidence with the same methodical attention that had characterized every aspect of this investigation. He was a serious man in his 40s, with the kind of calm professionalism that suggested he'd built cases against much more dangerous criminals than the Chen family. "This is exceptional work," he told Sarah and me during our final briefing. "In 20 years of investigating money laundering operations, I've rarely seen documentation this comprehensive from someone outside law enforcement. Mrs. Chen, you've essentially done 6 months of federal investigation work for us." The plan they developed was precisely choreographed. Simultaneous raids would be conducted at David's law firm, the Chen family residence, and 3 properties they owned in different parts of Denver. Search warrants had been obtained for all financial accounts, computer systems, and business records associated with the family's various enterprises. Asset seizure orders were prepared for properties and accounts that could be traced to the money laundering operation. David, his parents, and his business partner Marcus Thompson would be arrested simultaneously to prevent any coordination of their responses or destruction of evidence. The timing was designed to ensure maximum shock value, giving them no opportunity to prepare defenses or activate the political connections they'd cultivated over years of charitable contributions and social networking. I wouldn't be present for any of the arrests or raids. Sarah had explained that my role in the investigation needed to remain confidential until David's trial, both to protect me from potential retaliation and to preserve the integrity of the evidence I'd helped gather. But Agent Torres had arranged for me to observe the arrests from an unmarked surveillance vehicle parked across the street from David's law firm. The morning of the raids was crisp and clear, one of those perfect Colorado days when the mountains seemed close enough to touch. I sat in the passenger seat of an FBI surveillance van, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, watching through tinted windows as federal agents prepared to dismantle the life David had built on lies and criminal proceeds. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, 6 black SUVs pulled up outside Chen Associates. Agents in bulletproof vests emerged with practiced efficiency, moving through the building's entrance like a precisely coordinated military unit. Within minutes, employees were being escorted from the building as evidence teams began the systematic process of seizing files, computers, and financial records. David emerged in handcuffs 20 minutes later, flanked by 2 federal agents. Even from across the street, I could see the shock on his face, the complete bewilderment of someone whose world had just collapsed without warning. He moved like a man in a dream, stumbling slightly as the agents guided him toward one of the waiting vehicles. As the SUV carrying my ex-husband drove away, Agent Torres received radio confirmation that the other raids were proceeding smoothly. Victoria and Robert Chen had been arrested at their Cherry Creek mansion, where agents were in the process of seizing artwork, jewelry, and financial documents worth millions of dollars. Marcus Thompson had been taken into custody at his downtown office, along with several associates who had been involved in creating the shell companies used for money laundering. 47 federal agents, Torres told me as we watched the last of the evidence being loaded into FBI vehicles. 12 locations raided simultaneously. Over 200 boxes of evidence seized. 5 years of investigation work completed in a single morning, thanks to the foundation you provided. The news coverage began within hours. Local television stations led with breaking reports about federal raids targeting a prominent Denver law firm and one of the city's most respected families. The initial reports were careful, using phrases like alleged financial crimes and ongoing federal investigation. But the images of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from Chen family properties told a story that needed no elaboration. By evening, national news networks had picked up the story. The Chen family's money laundering operation was being described as one of the largest ever uncovered in the Mountain West region. Federal prosecutors were promising additional arrests as the investigation continued. Legal experts were speculating about potential prison sentences that could span decades. I watched it all from my small apartment in Stapleton, the place I'd moved to after David had demanded I vacate our townhouse. The contrast couldn't have been starker. 8 months ago, I'd been living in a beautiful home in Lakewood, married to a successful attorney, part of Denver's social elite. Now I was alone in a modest 1-bedroom apartment, unemployed after taking leave from Colorado Financial Group to focus on the investigation, watching my former life implode on national television. But I felt no regret, no sadness for what I'd destroyed. The people being arrested weren't victims of overzealous federal prosecutors. They were criminals who had spent years stealing money from drug addicts and violence victims, using their wealth and social connections to insulate themselves from the consequences of their actions. The respected family that had dismissed me as too naive to understand their world had been running an operation that directly contributed to the overdose deaths and gang violence that plagued communities across the region. 3 days after the arrests, Sarah called with an update that brought a smile to my face. David's attorney had contacted federal prosecutors about the possibility of a plea agreement. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that a trial would be essentially pointless. He was facing potential sentences of 25 to 30 years in federal prison, and his attorney was hoping to negotiate something closer to 15 years in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. He wants to make a deal, Sarah explained. But the prosecutors aren't particularly interested in what he has to offer. Your evidence was so comprehensive that they don't need his cooperation to convict the other defendants. He's in a position where he has nothing to bargain with and everything to lose. The irony was perfect. David had tried to use his legal expertise and family connections to destroy me in our divorce proceedings. Now those same legal skills were useless against the federal case I'd helped build against him. The man who had dismissed me as too simple to understand complex financial arrangements was being outsmarted by the wife he'd underestimated. But the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later when Sarah received a call from David's divorce attorney. With David facing decades in federal prison and the Chen family's assets frozen pending criminal proceedings, the original divorce settlement was no longer viable. In fact, David's attorney was now asking if I might be willing to negotiate a more reasonable division of marital assets. They want to settle quickly and quietly, Sarah told me. David's attorney is concerned that a prolonged divorce proceeding will complicate his criminal defense. They're offering a 50-50 split of all marital assets, plus spousal support, plus reimbursement for your legal fees. 50-50 spousal support, legal fees, everything I'd asked for originally and more. The same people who had offered me $15,000 and 30 days to disappear were now begging me to accept millions of dollars in assets and ongoing financial support. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. Tell them no, I said. Sarah paused. Rachel, this is a substantial offer, much more than we could expect to win in court, even with everything we know about their criminal activity. I don't want their money, I said, and I realized I meant it completely. I don't want anything that came from their drug money and blood money. I want a clean divorce, with no financial ties to any of them, and I want David to know that I'm walking away by choice, not because he forced me out. The final divorce decree was signed 6 weeks later. I received no financial settlement, no spousal support, no share of David's assets. In return, I relinquished any claim to property or income associated with the Chen family. It was exactly what David had wanted originally, except now it was my choice rather than his demand. David was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to money laundering, racketeering, and tax evasion. His parents received sentences of 12 and 10 years respectively. Marcus Thompson was sentenced to 15 years. The Chen family's entire financial empire was seized by the federal government, with proceeds earmarked for drug treatment programs and victim compensation funds. I never saw David again after the morning of his arrest. He was transferred to a federal prison in Texas after his sentencing, where he would spend the next decade and a half learning what it meant to be powerless and forgotten. I hoped the experience would teach him humility, but I suspected he would emerge from prison the same entitled, manipulative person he'd always been, just older and more bitter. The woman who had spent 8 years trying to earn his love and respect had finally realized that neither was worth having. 6 months after David's sentencing, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Boulder reviewing business plans for a venture that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating pages covered with financial projections and market analysis, the tools of a trade I'd mastered long before I understood how it would save my life. Mountain Peak Financial Services existed only on paper at that point, but the concept was solid. A consulting firm specializing in forensic accounting and financial investigation, serving small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and individuals who suspected they were victims of fraud, but couldn't afford the major firms that charged hundreds of dollars per hour for similar services. The idea had emerged from conversations with Agent Torres, who had mentioned how often federal investigators encountered financial crimes that were too small to warrant federal attention, but too complex for local police departments to handle effectively. Embezzlement at small companies, nonprofit fraud, elder financial abuse, divorce asset hiding, crimes that devastated individual victims but fell through the cracks of the traditional legal system. I had the skills to investigate these cases, and I had first-hand experience with the kind of financial manipulation that left victims feeling powerless and confused. More importantly, I had learned that financial crimes were rarely about money alone. They were about power, control, and the assumption that certain people could be victimized without consequence. The startup capital came from an unexpected source. Agent Torres had mentioned my case to a documentary filmmaker named Grace Bennett, who was working on a project about financial crimes in affluent communities. Grace was fascinated by the story of a woman who had single-handedly uncovered and dismantled a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation, and she wanted to feature my case in her film. I was initially reluctant to participate. The investigation and trial had already attracted more attention than I was comfortable with, and I preferred to focus on building my new life rather than revisiting the destruction of my old one. But Grace convinced me that sharing my story could help other women who found themselves in similar situations, trapped in relationships with financially manipulative partners who used money as a weapon. The documentary fee wasn't substantial, but it was enough to cover the initial expenses of starting my consulting firm. More importantly, the film's release led to inquiries from potential clients who had seen the documentary and recognized patterns in their own experience. My first official case came from Emma Sullivan, a nurse whose elderly mother had been systematically defrauded by a man claiming to be a financial advisor. Emma had suspected something was wrong when her mother's savings began disappearing, but the local police had dismissed her concerns as a family dispute, and private investigators had quoted fees she couldn't afford. Working with Emma reminded me why I'd chosen this path. Her mother, Margaret, was a retired teacher who had saved carefully for 40 years, accumulating a modest nest egg that should have ensured her dignity and independence in her final year. The man who had targeted her was sophisticated, patient, and utterly ruthless in exploiting her trust and confusion. It took 3 weeks to trace the full scope of the fraud. Margaret's financial advisor had stolen over $200,000 through forged documents, unauthorized transfers, and investment schemes that existed only on paper. But more devastating than the financial loss was the psychological damage. Margaret blamed herself for being foolish, for trusting someone who had seemed so knowledgeable and professional. I should have known better, she told me during one of our meetings, her hands shaking as she signed affidavits documenting the fraud. I taught school for 35 years. I should have been smarter than this. Helping Margaret recover her money was satisfying, but helping her understand that she wasn't to blame was more important. Financial predators succeeded by targeting people's trust and generosity, qualities that should be celebrated rather than punished. The shame belonged to the criminals who exploited those qualities, not to the victims who possessed them. The success of Margaret's case led to others: a small nonprofit, whose board treasurer had been embezzling donations; a divorced woman whose ex-husband had hidden assets in offshore accounts to avoid paying child support; a small business owner whose partner had been skimming cash receipts for years. Each case reinforced lessons I'd learned during my own ordeal. Financial abuse was rarely just about money. It was about power and control, about convincing victims that they were too naive or stupid to understand what was happening to them. The most effective financial predators were often charming, educated people who used their social status and professional credentials to deflect suspicion. But victims were never as powerless as they believed. Financial crimes left paper trails, and those trails could be followed by anyone with the right skills and sufficient determination. The same analytical abilities that made someone effective in business or education could be applied to uncovering fraud. The key was refusing to be intimidated by complexity or convinced that financial matters were beyond ordinary understanding. As Mountain Peak Financial Services grew, I began offering workshops and seminars for community groups, teaching people how to recognize and respond to financial fraud. The audiences were typically older adults, women going through divorces, and small business owners, people who had been targeted because they were perceived as vulnerable or naive. The workshops were always emotional experiences. Participants shared stories of betrayal by family members, romantic partners, business associates, and trusted advisors. But they also shared strategies for fighting back, resources for getting help, and encouragement for others who felt overwhelmed by their situation. One evening after a workshop at a community center in downtown Denver, a woman in her 40s approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "My ex-husband told me I was too stupid to understand our finances, and I believed him for years. Tonight I realized that I'm not stupid, he was just lying." Moments like that reminded me why I'd chosen this path rather than accepting a comfortable settlement from the Chen family and disappearing into anonymous prosperity. I'd learned that being underestimated could be an advantage, that the skills dismissed as unimportant by powerful people could be exactly what was needed to hold them accountable. The documentary about my case aired on a major streaming platform 2 years after David's sentence. Grace had done exceptional work, presenting the story as both a cautionary tale about financial abuse and an inspiring example of how ordinary people could fight back against seemingly overwhelming odds. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people contacted me through the film's website, sharing their own stories of financial manipulation and asking for advice about how to investigate suspicious activities in their own lives. Several women mentioned that they had recognized patterns in their marriages that paralleled my experience with David, and they were beginning to ask questions they'd never thought to ask before. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Agent Torres called to tell me that the documentary had been included in training materials for federal investigators, as an example of how civilian cooperation could enhance complex financial crime investigations. "Your case changed how we approach these investigations," he told me. "We're training agents to work more effectively with victims who have analytical skills, to recognize that some of our best investigators might be sitting in the civilian world, dealing with these crimes on a personal level." That conversation crystallized something I'd been thinking about for months. My experience with the Chen family investigation hadn't been an anomaly or a lucky accident. It had been the result of applying professional skills to a personal situation, of refusing to accept that complexity was the same as impossibility. 3 years after my divorce was finalized, I was invited to speak at a conference for forensic accountants in Chicago. The audience was composed of professionals who investigated financial crimes for major corporations and federal agencies, experts who commanded 6-figure salaries and worked on cases involving billions of dollars. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of people whose careers were built on the same skills that had saved my life, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. I had transformed the worst experience of my life into something that could help others, turning betrayal into purpose and pain into power. "Financial abuse succeeds when victims believe they're powerless," I told the audience. "The most important thing we can do as professionals is to teach people that financial complexity doesn't require financial expertise to overcome. Every financial crime leaves traces, and those traces can be followed by anyone willing to learn." After the conference, I flew back to Denver with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since before my marriage began to unravel. The work I was doing mattered, not just to individual clients, but to a broader community of people who had been taught to believe that financial systems were too complex for ordinary understanding. That belief was the foundation upon which every financial predator built their success. The expansion of Mountain Peak Financial Services came naturally, driven by demand rather than ambition. Dr. Patricia Wells, the forensic accountant who had worked on my original case against David, joined as a partner 6 months after the Chicago conference. Her expertise in complex corporate structures complemented my skills in individual fraud investigation, allowing us to take on larger cases while maintaining our focus on underserved victims. Our first major corporate case involved a nonprofit organization called Mile High Youth Services, which provided after-school programs and summer camps for disadvantaged children in the Denver area. The organization's board had contacted us after noticing discrepancies in their annual financial audit, irregularities that their regular accounting firm had dismissed as clerical errors. The executive director, a charismatic man named Richard Calloway, had been with the organization for 8 years, building its budget from $300,000 to over $2 million annually. He was beloved by staff and volunteers, known for his passionate advocacy for the children they served and his ability to cultivate relationships with major donors. But Patricia's analysis of the financial records revealed a pattern of systematic theft that spanned most of Calloway's tenure. He had created false vendor accounts, inflated program costs, and diverted donation funds through a network of shell companies he controlled. The total theft exceeded $800,000, money that should have provided meals, educational support, and safe spaces for some of Denver's most vulnerable children. The case was particularly painful because of what the stolen money represented. Every dollar Calloway had stolen was a dollar that didn't go to keeping kids off the streets, providing tutoring for struggling students, or offering summer programs that gave working parents affordable childcare. His theft had a direct impact on families who were already struggling, people who trusted that their donated time and money was being used to help their community. But the investigation also revealed something that had become a pattern in my work. Calloway had succeeded for so long because board members, donors, and even staff had been reluctant to question his financial management. He had cultivated an image of passionate dedication that made scrutiny seem like betrayal of the mission. When concerns were raised, he had deflected them by emphasizing the complexity of nonprofit finances and the need to trust professional expertise. The board members were intelligent, successful people, but they had allowed themselves to be convinced that financial oversight was beyond their capabilities. They had accepted that asking detailed questions about spending and budgeting would somehow compromise their ability to support the organization's mission. Calloway had used their goodwill and dedication against them, turning their trust into a weapon for his own enrichment. Working with the Mile High Youth Services Board to implement new financial controls and oversight procedures reminded me of conversations I'd had with my own family after David's arrest. My parents, both retired teachers with decades of experience managing school budgets, had been shocked by the complexity of the financial crimes I'd uncovered. They had assumed that money laundering and corporate fraud required sophisticated knowledge they didn't possess. But when I showed them the basic patterns I'd identified, the unexplained income sources and circular transactions that had first caught my attention, they immediately understood the logical inconsistency. The same critical thinking skills they'd used in education applied perfectly to financial analysis. They hadn't needed advanced degrees in accounting or finance to recognize that something was wrong with the Chen family's money flow. That realization had prompted me to develop what I called financial literacy for fraud detection workshops, sessions designed to teach ordinary people how to recognize and investigate suspicious financial activities in their own lives. The curriculum covered basic concepts like tracing money flows, identifying shell companies, and recognizing common fraud patterns, but it also emphasized the psychological tactics that financial predators used to discourage scrutiny. The workshops grew in popularity as word spread through community organizations, senior centers, and women's groups. Participants ranged from elderly people concerned about investment scams, to divorced women trying to understand their ex-husband's business dealings, to small business owners wanting to protect themselves from employee theft. Each session reinforced the same fundamental truth that I'd learned during my own experience with David. Financial crimes succeeded not because they were inherently undetectable, but because victims were convinced that detection required expertise they didn't possess. The moment someone started asking the right questions and demanding clear answers, most fraud schemes began to unravel. One of my most memorable workshop participants was a woman named Carol Henderson, a retired librarian in her 70s who had been targeted by a romance scam. Carol had met Jonathan through an online dating site, and over several months, he had convinced her that he was a successful businessman, temporarily stranded overseas due to legal complications with an inheritance. The story was familiar, a variation on classic romance scams that targeted lonely older adults. Jonathan needed money for legal fees, medical emergencies, and travel expenses, always with the promise that he would repay everything once his inheritance was released. Carol had sent him over $30,000 before beginning to suspect that something was wrong. What made Carol's case unique was her response to discovering the fraud. Instead of feeling embarrassed and trying to hide what had happened, she had documented every interaction with Jonathan, saved screenshots of their conversations, and begun researching similar cases online. By the time she attended my workshop, she had assembled a comprehensive file on the scammer's methods and was working with federal authorities to trace his activities. I spent 40 years teaching people how to research and verify information, Carol told me after the workshop. I should have applied those same skills to this situation from the beginning. Just because it was romantic doesn't mean it should have been any less carefully examined. Carol's case became a teaching example I used in future workshops, not just because of the fraud itself but because of her response to discovering it. She had refused to accept shame or embarrassment for being victimized, instead channeling her anger into action that could help protect others. Her research had contributed to a federal investigation that ultimately led to the arrest of an international romance scam ring. The success of these individual cases led to recognition from law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations. The Colorado Attorney General's office began referring financial fraud cases to Mountain Peak when the amounts involved were too small for major firms, but too complex for local police departments. The Better Business Bureau invited me to speak at their fraud prevention seminar. The Federal Trade Commission featured one of our cases in their educational materials about elder financial abuse, but the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Sarah Kim, the attorney who had helped me build the case against David, called to tell me that she was being contacted by women whose situations paralleled my own experience. Wives and ex-wives who suspected their husbands of financial crimes, but weren't sure how to investigate their suspicions or where to turn for help. Your case has become a template, Sarah explained. Women are realizing that the same red flags you noticed might be present in their own relationships. They're asking questions they never thought to ask before, and they're discovering that their financial intuition was correct. She referred several of these cases to Mountain Peak, and each one reinforced patterns I had observed in my own marriage to David. Successful, charming men who used their professional credentials to deflect questions about their income sources. Wives who were systematically excluded from financial decisions, while being blamed for not understanding complex business arrangements. Families whose lifestyle exceeded their documented income, with expenses funded through mechanisms that didn't withstand careful scrutiny. One case involved a woman named Jennifer Walsh, whose husband claimed to be a successful real estate investor, but whose properties were actually being used to launder money for a gambling operation. Another involved Lisa Park, whose ex-husband had hidden millions in divorce proceedings, using cryptocurrency accounts and offshore trusts. In each case, the woman had noticed inconsistencies and unexplained patterns, but had been convinced that her concerns were unfounded or insignificant. Working with these clients reminded me of the isolation I had felt during my marriage to David. The sense that my questions and observations were somehow inappropriate or naive. These women had been systematically gaslighted about their own intelligence and intuition, taught to doubt their ability to understand situations that were actually quite straightforward once examined objectively. The process of helping them investigate their suspicions and build cases against their husbands was deeply satisfying, but it also revealed the broader scope of financial abuse within seemingly successful marriages. The cases that came to my attention were likely just a fraction of similar situations. Instances where women had learned to stop asking questions rather than continuing to challenge explanations that didn't make sense. As Mountain Peak's reputation grew, we began receiving inquiries from attorneys in other states who were handling similar cases. The methods I had developed for investigating complex financial fraud were apparently applicable across a wide range of situations and jurisdictions. Patricia and I started offering consulting services to legal teams who needed help unraveling sophisticated financial crimes and divorce proceedings. This consulting work led to discoveries that were both fascinating and disturbing. We uncovered cases where successful professionals had been running elaborate Ponzi schemes to fund lavish lifestyles, while hiding their crimes from spouses and children. We found instances of corporate executives embezzling millions from their companies while presenting themselves as pillars of their communities. We documented cases where respected businessmen were using their companies to facilitate human trafficking and drug smuggling operations. In each case, the perpetrators had succeeded by convincing those around them that financial complexity required blind trust rather than informed oversight. They had used their education, social status, and professional credentials to deflect scrutiny and discourage questions. They had created environments where asking for documentation or verification was treated as disrespectful or inappropriate. But they had also succeeded because their victims had been taught to believe that financial systems were inherently beyond ordinary understanding. The same women who managed household budgets, ran small businesses, or handled complex professional responsibilities had been convinced that they lacked the expertise to evaluate their husband's financial activities. This disconnect between capability and confidence became a central focus of my speaking engagements and workshops. I began emphasizing that financial literacy wasn't primarily about understanding complex investment strategies or corporate structure. It was about applying critical thinking skills to financial information, asking logical questions about income sources and expense patterns, and refusing to accept complexity as an excuse for opacity. The message resonated with audiences across the country. I was invited to speak at conferences for financial planners, family law attorneys, and victim advocacy organizations. Each presentation reinforced the same core principles that had guided my own investigation of David's activity. Financial crimes could be detected and prosecuted by ordinary people who were willing to ask difficult questions and insist on clear answers. But the most important validation came from the outcomes of the cases we handled. Over 3 years, Mountain Peak Financial Services had helped clients recover over $12 million in stolen assets. We had contributed to federal investigations that resulted in dozens of criminal convictions. We had helped implement financial oversight procedures that protected hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals from future fraud. More importantly, we had helped people understand that they were not powerless in the face of financial manipulation. The same analytical skills that made someone effective in other areas of life could be applied to detecting and addressing financial crimes. The key was refusing to be intimidated by artificial complexity and maintaining confidence in one's own observations and instincts. The 4th anniversary of my divorce from David approached with little fanfare. I was living in a comfortable house in Boulder, running a successful business that provided both personal satisfaction and financial security. The life I had built bore no resemblance to the one I had shared with David, but it was entirely my own creation, built on skills and values that no one could take away from me. I rarely thought about David anymore, though I occasionally received updates about his situation from news articles or court filings. He was serving his sentence at a federal prison in Texas, apparently maintaining his innocence despite his guilty plea and the overwhelming evidence against him. His expected release date was still more than a decade away, and he would face additional state charges when his federal sentence was completed. Victoria and Robert Chen had been released after serving 6 and 4 years respectively, but their lives bore no resemblance to their former prosperity. All of their assets had been seized by the federal government, and they were living in a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Denver. Victoria had taken a job as a receptionist at a medical clinic, while Robert worked part-time as a bookkeeper for small businesses. Their fall from grace had been swift and complete, but I felt no satisfaction from their suffering. They were elderly people who had made terrible choices and were paying appropriate consequences for their crime. Their punishment was a matter for the legal system, not a source of personal vindication for me. What mattered more was the life I had built from the wreckage of their betrayal. Every client I helped, every workshop I conducted, every case I solved was a reminder that destruction could be transformed into creation, that pain could be converted into purpose. The skills I had developed to survive my marriage to David had become tools for helping others survive similar ordeals. The woman who had once sat quietly at dinner tables, invisible and dismissed, had become someone who spoke with authority about financial crimes to audiences of law enforcement professionals and corporate executives. The wife who had been told she was too naive to understand money had built a business based on her ability to unravel complex financial frauds that had stumped federal investigators. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that the power to define my own worth didn't come from external validation or professional success. It came from the decision to refuse to be diminished by other people's limitations and cruelty, to insist on my own value regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. Standing in my home office one evening, reviewing case files for the next day's work, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The path from David's betrayal to my current life had been painful and uncertain, but it had also been entirely my own choice. I had decided how to respond to his attempts to destroy me, how to use the skills he had dismissed, and how to build something meaningful from the ruins of our marriage. The woman David had tried to erase had not only survived but thrived, creating value and meaning that extended far beyond his ability to comprehend or damage. That was the most complete victory I could have imagined, not because it harmed him, but because it demonstrated the futility of his attempts to define my worth or control my future. The next morning would bring new cases, new clients, new opportunities to transform someone else's crisis into strength and knowledge. It was work that mattered, work that used every skill I possessed in service of justice and truth. It was the life I had chosen for myself, built on the foundation of everything David and his family had tried to destroy. Looking back, I realized that their betrayal had been the best thing that ever happened to me, not because I enjoyed the pain, but because it had forced me to discover who I really was beneath the roles and expectations others had imposed. The woman who emerged from that crisis was stronger, more capable, and more purposeful than the person who had walked into that conference room to sign divorce papers 4 years earlier. David had tried to reduce me to nothing, but he had actually set me free to become everything I was meant to be. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in late September, 5 years after David's sentencing. I was reviewing client files in my Boulder office when Agent Torres called with news that initially seemed routine, but would ultimately reshape my understanding of the case that had defined my adult life. "Rachel, we've received some interesting information about your ex-husband's case," Torres said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to deliver surprising news without editorial comment. "David has been cooperating with federal investigators for the past 8 months, providing information about criminal networks that extend far beyond what we uncovered in Denver." The revelation was stunning. David, who had maintained his innocence throughout his trial and initial years of imprisonment, had apparently decided that cooperation with federal authorities was preferable to serving his full sentence. According to Torres, David's information had been instrumental in dismantling criminal organizations across multiple states, leading to dozens of arrests and the seizure of assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "The scope of what he's revealed is extraordinary," Torres continued. "The Chen family operation wasn't just laundering money for regional drug dealers. They were part of an international network that included human trafficking, arms dealing, and cryptocurrency fraud." David's legal expertise made him valuable to criminal organizations across the western United States and parts of Mexico. As Torres described the broader conspiracy that David had helped expose, I found myself struggling to reconcile this information with my understanding of the man I had been married to for 8 years. The David I had known was ambitious and ethically flexible, but I had never imagined him as someone capable of facilitating human trafficking or arms dealing. The crimes Torres was describing went far beyond financial fraud into territories of violence and exploitation that seemed incompatible with the corporate lawyer who had worried about maintaining his reputation in Denver's legal community. But as I reflected on our marriage and the patterns I had noticed in David's behavior, I began to see how his descent into serious criminality might have been gradual and incremental. The man who could dismiss his wife's concerns about unexplained income, might also be capable of ignoring the human cost of his client's activities. The person who could lie systematically about financial arrangements might also be willing to facilitate crimes he chose not to examine too closely. Torres explained that David's cooperation had earned him a significant reduction in his federal sentence. Instead of serving 18 years, he would likely be released within the next 2 years, assuming his continued cooperation and good behavior. The news agencies hadn't yet reported on his cooperation agreement, but Torres wanted me to be aware of the situation before it became public knowledge. The possibility that David might be free within 2 years triggered an unexpected emotional response. I had built my new life on the assumption that he would remain imprisoned for the foreseeable future, that the threat he represented to my peace of mind was contained by concrete walls and federal security. The prospect of his return to society, even as a convicted felon with limited opportunities, felt like a disruption to the equilibrium I had carefully constructed. But my primary concern wasn't personal safety or fear of retaliation. David had never been physically violent, and his cooperation with federal authorities had presumably severed any connections he might have had to dangerous criminal organizations. I worried about the narrative implications of his early release, the possibility that his cooperation might be interpreted as evidence that his crimes had been less serious than originally believed. Torres seemed to understand my concerns without my having to articulate them completely. David's cooperation doesn't diminish the seriousness of his original crimes or the validity of your investigation, he said. The information he provided was valuable precisely because of how deeply embedded he was in these criminal networks. His cooperation confirms rather than contradicts the evidence you helped us gather. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking frequently about David's decision to cooperate with federal investigators. The man who had maintained his innocence for years, who had blamed his prosecution on vindictive federal authorities and an ex-wife seeking revenge, had apparently concluded that honesty was more beneficial than continued defiance. The question that nagged at me was whether his cooperation represented genuine remorse for his crimes, or simply another calculated decision based on self-interest. The answer came in an unexpected form 3 months later. I received a letter at my office, forwarded through the federal prison system with all the official stamps and security protocols that accompanied correspondence from incarcerated individuals. The return address identified David Chen as the sender, and for a moment, I considered discarding the letter without reading it. Our divorce had severed all legal and financial connections between us, and I had no desire to resume any form of communication. But curiosity ultimately overcame my reluctance. I opened the letter carefully, unsure what to expect from someone who had spent years blaming me for his imprisonment and the destruction of his family's criminal enterprise. The letter was longer than I had anticipated, written in David's familiar handwriting but with a tone I had never encountered in our years of marriage. It began with what appeared to be a genuine acknowledgement of responsibility for his crimes and an expression of remorse for the harm he had caused to multiple victims, including me. He wrote about the gradual process through which he had become involved in increasingly serious criminal activities, describing a progression that had started with minor legal gray areas and escalated into the full-scale money laundering operation that had ultimately destroyed his life. But it was the letter's conclusion that surprised me most profoundly. David wrote that he had spent considerable time during his imprisonment thinking about our marriage and the dynamics that had led to its dissolution. He acknowledged that he had treated me with disrespect and condescension, that he had dismissed my intelligence and contributions, and that his behavior had been motivated by insecurity about his own worthiness rather than any legitimate concerns about my capability. I realize now that you were the best person in my life, he wrote, and I destroyed our relationship because I was threatened by your integrity and intelligence. I convinced myself that you were naive and simple because admitting your perceptiveness would have forced me to confront the criminal path I was choosing. Your investigation of my activities wasn't vindictive or vindictive. It was the natural response of someone with a functioning moral compass to discovering serious wrongdoing. The letter included no requests for forgiveness or reconciliation, no suggestions that we might resume contact after his release. Instead, David wrote that he wanted me to know that his cooperation with federal authorities had been motivated partly by a desire to provide some measure of justice for the victims of the criminal networks he had facilitated. He hoped that his information might help recover stolen assets and prevent future crimes, though he understood that such cooperation could never fully compensate for the harm he had enabled. Reading David's letter triggered a complex mix of emotions I hadn't expected. There was satisfaction in seeing him finally acknowledge truths about our relationship that I had recognized years earlier, but also sadness for the waste of potential that his criminal choices represent. The man who had written this letter seemed capable of the growth and self-reflection that might have saved our marriage if it had occurred a decade earlier. But I also recognized that David's apparent remorse, however genuine it might be, didn't change the fundamental realities of what had transpired between us. He had chosen to participate in crimes that harmed vulnerable people, and he had attempted to destroy my reputation and financial security when I discovered his activity. His acknowledgement of these facts was psychologically satisfying but practically irrelevant to the life I had built in his absence. I wrote a brief response thanking him for his honesty, but making clear that I considered our communication concluded. I had no interest in maintaining contact with someone whose return to society would remind me of the most painful period of my life, regardless of whatever personal growth he might have achieved during his imprisonment. The woman who had once loved him had moved beyond the need for his validation or apology. The public revelation of David's cooperation came 6 months later, when federal prosecutors announced the conclusion of a major investigation into international money laundering network. The press coverage was extensive, describing a criminal conspiracy that had facilitated billions of dollars in illegal transactions across multiple countries and criminal organizations. David was mentioned as a key cooperating witness whose information had been crucial to the investigation's success. The news stories inevitably revisited the original Chen family case, describing how a routine divorce investigation had uncovered evidence that led to the dismantling of a major criminal network. Several articles mentioned my role in the original investigation, though most focused on the broader law enforcement operation rather than the personal dynamics that had initiated the case. The renewed media attention brought a fresh wave of inquiries to Mountain Peak Financial Service. Attorneys, law enforcement agencies, and potential clients who had learned about my work through the news coverage reached out with cases that required specialized financial investigation skills. The publicity was professionally beneficial, but it also served as a reminder of how much my life had changed since the naive woman who had trusted David's explanations about unexplained income. One of the most significant new cases came from the Federal Trade Commission, which was investigating a multi-state telemarketing fraud that had targeted elderly consumers with fake charity solicitation. The scammers had stolen millions of dollars by impersonating representatives of legitimate organizations, using sophisticated psychological manipulation to convince victims that their donations were supporting worthy causes. Working with federal investigators on the telemarketing case reminded me of the skills I had developed during my investigation of David's activity. The same attention to detail, the same ability to trace complex financial patterns, the same willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about inconsistencies and unexplained transactions. But the scale of the telemarketing fraud was much larger than anything the Chen family had been involved in, and the victims were more vulnerable than the drug dealers and criminal organizations that had used David's service. The investigation revealed a network of call centers across multiple states, staffed by people who had been trained to use specific psychological techniques to overcome elderly victims' natural skepticism about phone solicitation. The callers were provided with detailed scripts that included responses to common objections, strategies for creating false urgency, and methods for extracting maximum donations from each victim. But what made the case particularly disturbing was the sophistication of the identity theft component. The scammers weren't just stealing money through fake donations, they were also gathering personal information that allowed them to access victims' bank accounts, credit cards, and investment accounts. Many victims discovered the full extent of their losses only months after their initial contact with the fraudulent telemarketers. Patricia and I spent 6 months working with federal investigators to trace the money flows and identify the organizational structure of the telemarketing network. The case required analyzing thousands of bank transactions, phone records, and corporate filings to map the relationships between various call centers, management companies, and the individuals who ultimately controlled the operation. The complexity of the investigation was comparable to our work on David's case, but the human impact was more immediate and visible. We interviewed dozens of elderly victims who had lost life savings to the fraudulent charity scheme, people whose trust and generosity had been exploited by criminals who understood exactly how to manipulate their psychological vulnerabilities. One victim, an 80-year-old former nurse named Dorothy Chen, had donated over $40,000 to what she believed were legitimate cancer research and veterans assistance organizations. Dorothy had lost her husband to cancer 5 years earlier, and the telemarketing scammers had used her grief and desire to help other families as weapons against her. "I just wanted to do something good with the money Harold left me," Dorothy told me during one of our interviews. "I thought I was helping children with cancer get the treatment they needed. Instead, I was paying for some criminal's vacation home." Working with victims like Dorothy reinforced my understanding of why financial fraud was never just about money. The scammers had stolen Dorothy's savings, but they had also violated her trust in charitable organizations and her belief in her own judgment. The psychological damage was often more devastating than the financial loss, leaving victims feeling foolish and vulnerable in ways that affected every aspect of their lives. But Dorothy's case also demonstrated the resilience that many fraud victims possessed once they understood that they were dealing with professional criminals rather than their own poor judgment. Dorothy became an active participant in the federal investigation, helping identify other victims and providing detailed information about the psychological techniques the scammers had used to manipulate her. "I'm not the first intelligent person to be fooled by professional liars," Dorothy told me near the end of our work together, "and I won't be the last. But I can make sure that my experience helps put these people in prison where they belong." The telemarketing investigation ultimately resulted in 43 federal indictments and the recovery of over $60 million in stolen assets. Dorothy recovered most of her losses, though the emotional impact of being victimized would likely remain with her for the rest of her life. But she had also gained something valuable through her participation in the investigation, a sense of agency and purpose that transformed her from a passive victim into an active advocate for fraud prevention. The success of the telemarketing case led to additional referrals from federal agencies dealing with complex financial crimes. Mountain Peak Financial Services became known as a firm that could handle investigations, requiring both technical expertise and sensitivity to victim trauma. We developed protocols for working with elderly fraud victims, training programs for law enforcement agencies, and educational materials for community organizations, trying to protect their members from financial predators. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of our expanded work was the opportunity to help people understand that being victimized by financial fraud wasn't a reflection of their intelligence or character. The criminals who targeted them were professionals who had spent years perfecting their psychological manipulation technique. Falling victim to such sophisticated schemes wasn't evidence of weakness. It was evidence of human qualities like trust and generosity that should be celebrated rather than punished. This message resonated particularly strongly with women who had been financially abused by intimate partners. Many of the wives and ex-wives who contacted Mountain Peak had been convinced by their abusers that they were too naive or emotional to understand financial matters. Breaking through that conditioning required not just financial investigation skills, but also therapeutic understanding of how psychological abuse affected victims' confidence in their own perception. Working with these clients reminded me daily of my own journey from the confused, dismissed wife sitting in that conference room signing divorce papers, to the confident professional who now spoke with authority about complex financial crime. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy, but it had been complete. The woman David had tried to erase had not only survived but had become someone who helped other women recognize and reclaim their own strength. As David's release date approached, I found myself reflecting on the strange trajectory that had brought us both to this point. He would emerge from prison as a convicted felon with limited opportunities, forever marked by his cooperation with federal authorities and his criminal history. I had emerged from our divorce as a successful entrepreneur whose expertise was sought by federal agencies and corporate clients across the country. The contrast wasn't accidental or lucky, it was the result of choices we had each made when faced with moral and practical challenge. David had chosen criminality, deception, and the exploitation of others' trust. I had chosen honesty, hard work, and service to victims of the kinds of crimes he had facilitated. The outcomes we had each achieved were the logical consequences of those fundamental differences in character and values. But I also understood that David's cooperation with federal authorities, whatever his motivations, had contributed to justice for many victims of financial crime. His information had helped dismantle criminal networks, recover stolen assets, and prevent future crimes. The same knowledge that had made him valuable to criminal organizations had also made him valuable to law enforcement agencies seeking to understand and combat financial fraud. In some sense, David's cooperation represented a form of redemption, though one that could never fully compensate for the harm he had enabled or the trust he had violated. His decision to help federal investigators suggested that some part of the person I had once loved remained beneath the criminal he had become. That knowledge brought neither satisfaction nor sorrow, just a recognition that people were capable of both profound moral failure and meaningful attempts at restitution. The woman who had once hoped for his love and respect had moved far beyond the need for either. I had built a life of purpose and achievement that owed nothing to his validation or approval. Whether he spent the remainder of his life attempting to make amends for his crimes, or simply pursued his own interests with greater caution, was no longer relevant to my sense of worth or direction. Standing in my office one evening, reviewing case files for the next day's work, I realized that David's impending release held no terror or anticipation for me. He was simply another person in the world, someone whose choices had once affected my life profoundly, but who now existed at the periphery of my awareness. The power he had once wielded over my emotions and self-perception had been permanently broken by my decision to define my own value rather than accepting his assessment of my worth. That was perhaps the most complete victory I could have achieved, not because it harmed him, but because it demonstrated the futility of his attempts to control my future or limit my potential. The woman he had dismissed as too simple to understand complex financial arrangements had become an expert whose opinion was sought by federal investigators and corporate executives. The wife he had tried to erase had built a career based on skills he had never bothered to recognize or respect. But most importantly, I had learned that external validation, whether positive or negative, was ultimately irrelevant to genuine self-worth. The power to define my value came from within, from my choices and actions and the principles I chose to live. No one else, no matter how educated or wealthy or socially connected, had the authority to determine what I was capable of achieving or contributing to the world. That understanding had been worth every moment of pain and uncertainty I had endured during the collapse of my marriage and the investigation that followed. It was a lesson that no one could teach, and no one could take away. Knowledge that would guide and protect me, regardless of what challenges the future might bring. 7 years after David's arrest, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of our divorce proceeding. The International Association of Financial Crime Investigators was hosting their annual conference in Las Vegas, and they had asked me to deliver the keynote address on civilian contributions to complex financial investigation. Standing before an audience of 800 federal agents, forensic accountants, and corporate security professionals, I felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with professional recognition or career advancement. The woman who had once been dismissed as too naive to understand money was now being asked to teach experts how ordinary people could contribute to sophisticated criminal investigation. My presentation focused on the psychological barriers that prevented financial crimes from being detected and reported. I explained how perpetrators succeeded by convincing their victims that financial complexity required specialized expertise, when in reality most fraud schemes relied on logical inconsistencies that could be identified by anyone willing to ask persistent questions. The audience was engaged and responsive, asking detailed questions about investigative techniques and victim psychology. But the most meaningful moment came during the question period, when a young FBI agent asked how someone without law enforcement training could build the confidence necessary to challenge respected professionals about suspicious financial activity. Confidence doesn't come from credentials or training, I told her. It comes from trusting your own observations, and refusing to accept that complexity is the same as impossibility. The same critical thinking skills that make someone effective in any profession can be applied to financial investigation. The key is recognizing that your perspective as an outsider might actually be an advantage, because you're not constrained by professional assumptions about what's possible or appropriate. After my presentation, I was approached by several conference attendees who shared their own stories of cases that had been solved through civilian cooperation. A DEA agent described how a suspicious spouse had uncovered a massive money laundering operation by questioning her husband's unexplained business trips. A postal inspector explained how an elderly victim's detailed record-keeping had helped trace an international mail fraud scheme. Each story reinforced my belief that ordinary people possessed investigative capabilities that were often more valuable than specialized training. But the conversation that stayed with me longest came from Agent Torres, who had traveled from Denver to attend my presentation. During a quiet moment between conference sessions, he told me that my case had influenced how federal agencies approached financial crime investigations. We've started training agents to recognize and cultivate civilian cooperation. Your investigation demonstrated that some of our most effective partners might be people who are personally affected by the crimes we're investigating. They have motivation, access, and often analytical skills that complement our law enforcement training. Torres also shared news that brought our original investigation full circle. The Chen family's former associates, the criminal organizations that had used David's money laundering services, were still being dismantled based on information David had provided during his cooperation agreement. Several major cases were scheduled for trial over the coming year, with potential prison sentences that would effectively end the careers of dozens of high-level criminals. Your decision to investigate David's activities triggered a domino effect that's still producing results, Torres. Criminals who thought they were safely hidden behind layers of legal protection are discovering that their entire network was compromised by evidence you helped us gather. The knowledge that my investigation continued to generate justice for crime victims provided a sense of satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. The skills I had used to protect myself from David's financial abuse had ultimately contributed to protecting countless other victims from similar crimes. The pain and betrayal I had experienced had been transformed into something that created genuine value for society. Flying home from Las Vegas, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The terrified woman who had sat in Janet Morrison's office 7 years earlier, accepting legal advice that she should settle quietly for $15,000, had become someone whose opinions were sought by federal investigators and international crime prevention organizations. The transformation hadn't been the result of luck or circumstances beyond my control. It had been the product of deliberate choices about how to respond to betrayal and adversity. Those choices had required abandoning comfortable assumptions about fairness, justice, and the reliability of social institutions. I had learned that respected professionals could be criminals, that wealth and education didn't correlate with ethical behavior, and that legal systems often favored those with resources rather than those with legitimate grievances. But I had also learned that understanding these realities could be empowering rather than defeating, providing the knowledge necessary to navigate complex situations effectively. The most important lesson, however, had been about the source of genuine self-worth. For years I had sought validation from David and his family, measuring my value by their approval and acceptance. Their rejection had initially felt like confirmation of my inadequacy, evidence that I lacked the sophistication necessary to belong in their world. But their betrayal had ultimately freed me from the need for external validation, forcing me to develop internal standards for measuring my contributions and achievements. That freedom had made possible everything that followed. The investigation, the business, the speaking engagements, the federal cooperation, all of it had emerged from the decision to trust my own perceptions rather than accepting others' assessments of my capability. The woman who had been told she didn't understand money had discovered that she understood it better than the criminals who thought they could manipulate her. 2 months after the Las Vegas conference, I received news that felt like the final chapter of my original story. David had been released from federal prison after serving 6 years of his 18-year sentence. His early release, the result of his extensive cooperation with ongoing investigation. According to the brief news article I found online, he was living in a halfway house in Phoenix, working as a paralegal for a small firm that specialized in criminal defense. The information triggered no emotional response, positive or negative. David had become a stranger whose life occasionally intersected with news stories about the criminal network he had once belonged to. His early release was simply another development in a story that no longer affected my daily experience or future plans. But his freedom did prompt me to make a decision I had been considering for several months. Mountain Peak Financial Services had grown beyond what Patricia and I could manage effectively from our Boulder office. We were receiving case referrals from across the country, consulting requests from major corporations, and speaking invitations from professional organizations worldwide. The business needed to expand, but expansion would require choices about our mission and priority. After extensive discussion, Patricia and I decided to establish a nonprofit foundation dedicated to financial crime education and victim assistance. The Mountain Peak Foundation would provide free investigative services to individuals who suspected they were victims of financial fraud, but lacked the resources to hire private investigators or attorney. We would also develop educational programs for community organizations, schools, and professional groups, teaching people how to recognize and respond to financial crime. The Foundation's first major initiative was a partnership with the Colorado Attorney General's office to create a statewide financial fraud hotline. Trained volunteers, many of them retired professionals with backgrounds in finance, law enforcement, or social services, would provide initial consultation to callers who suspected they were victims of financial crime. Complex cases would be referred to appropriate law enforcement agencies or legal service providers, while simpler situations could be resolved through education and guidance. The hotline received over 3,000 calls during its first year of operation, ranging from elderly people targeted by romance scams to small business owners dealing with employee embezzlement. Each call reminded me of my own experience with financial betrayal, the confusion and isolation that came from suspecting that something was wrong but not knowing how to investigate or respond effectively. But the most rewarding aspect of the Foundation's work was seeing callers develop confidence in their own analytical abilities. Many people contacted the hotline convinced that they were too unsophisticated to understand what was happening to them. By the end of their consultation, they understood that their suspicions had been justified, and that they possessed the skills necessary to protect themselves from further victimization. One caller, a divorced woman named Rachel Martinez, had contacted the hotline because her ex-husband's child support payments had suddenly increased dramatically, accompanied by explanations about new business ventures that didn't seem credible. Susan worked as a school administrator and had no background in finance, but she recognized logical inconsistencies in her ex-husband's explanations about his income sources. Working with one of our volunteers, Susan learned how to research corporate filings, trace business ownership, and identify red flags in financial documentation. Her investigation revealed that her ex-husband was laundering money for a marijuana trafficking operation, using increased child support payments to move cash through their joint custody arrangement. "I thought I was being paranoid," Susan told me during a follow-up call, "but it turns out that my instincts were exactly right. I just needed someone to confirm that my questions were legitimate and show me how to find the answers." Susan's case became a model for the Foundation's approach to victim assistance. Rather than conducting investigations for callers, we taught them how to investigate suspicious activities themselves, providing guidance and resources, while empowering them to take control of their situation. This approach was more time-intensive than simply handling cases professionally, but it produced more durable results by giving victims skills they could use throughout their lives. The Foundation's educational programs expanded rapidly, reaching audiences that ranged from high school students, learning about financial literacy, to senior citizens, protecting themselves from elder fraud. Each presentation reinforced the same core message that had guided my own investigation of David's activities. Financial crimes could be detected and prevented by ordinary people who were willing to ask questions and insist on clear answers. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The federal judge who had sentenced David 7 years earlier contacted me through the U.S. Attorney's Office, requesting a meeting to discuss victim impact and restitution in financial crime cases. Judge Patricia Hamilton had presided over hundreds of financial crime prosecutions, but she was interested in my perspective as someone who had initiated a major federal investigation as a civilian. Our conversation took place in Judge Hamilton's chambers, a book-lined office that felt more like a professor's study than a federal courthouse. She was a thoughtful woman in her 60s, with the kind of measured speaking style that suggested every word was carefully considered before being spoken. Your case has influenced how I think about victim impact in financial crime prosecutions, she told me. Most victims of these crimes are portrayed as passive sufferers who need protection from sophisticated criminals, but your investigation demonstrated that victims can be active participants in achieving justice, sometimes more effective than traditional law enforcement approach. Judge Hamilton explained that she had begun incorporating victim empowerment principles into her sentencing decisions, encouraging prosecutors to work with victims who possessed investigative capabilities, rather than simply treating them as sources of evidence. She was also supporting legislative proposals that would provide funding for civilian financial crime education, recognizing that prevention, through knowledge, was more effective than prosecution after crimes had already occurred. The legal system tends to view financial crimes as contest between government prosecutors and defense attorneys, she said, but your case demonstrates that the most important participants might be the civilians who are directly affected by these crimes. They have the motivation and often the skills necessary to uncover evidence that professional investigators might miss. Our conversation reinforced my belief that the traditional approach to financial crime prevention was fundamentally flawed. Law enforcement agencies focused on prosecuting criminals after they had already victimized multiple people, while educational programs emphasized generic warnings about scams, rather than teaching practical investigative skills. A more effective approach would empower potential victims to recognize and investigate suspicious activities before significant harm occurs. That philosophy became the foundation for my second book, A Practical Guide to Financial Self-Defense, that was published 3 years after the Mountain Peak Foundation was established. Following the Money: How Ordinary People Can Investigate Financial Crimes, combined investigative techniques with psychological insights about how financial predators selected and manipulated their victims. The book's reception exceeded my expectations, spending several weeks on bestseller lists and generating speaking invitations from organizations across the country. But more importantly, it prompted thousands of readers to contact the foundation with their own stories of financial investigation and recovery. Many had used the book's techniques to uncover embezzlement, fraud, or hidden assets in their personal or professional life. One reader, a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, had used the book's guidance to investigate suspicious activities at her homeowners association. Her analysis of financial records revealed that the association's treasurer had been embezzling maintenance fees for over 5 years, using the stolen money to fund a gambling addiction. Margaret's investigation led to criminal charges and the recovery of over $200,000 in stolen funds. "I never thought I had the skills to investigate something like this," Margaret wrote in her letter to the foundation. "But your book showed me that the same organizational abilities I used in teaching could be applied to financial investigation. I just needed to trust my observations and refuse to accept confusing explanations." Stories like Margaret's reminded me daily of why the foundation's work mattered. Financial crimes succeeded because victims were convinced that they lacked the expertise necessary to understand what was happening to them. Breaking through that psychological barrier was often more important than providing technical training or professional resources. As I approached the 10th anniversary of my divorce from David, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory my life had taken. The woman who had once measured her worth by her husband's approval had become someone whose opinions were sought by federal judges and international crime prevention organizations. The wife who had been dismissed as too naive to understand money had written a bestseller about financial investigation techniques, but the most significant transformation had been internal rather than professional. I had learned that genuine security came not from external validation or material success, but from confidence in my own judgment and abilities. No one could take away the skills I had developed or the knowledge I had gained through adversity. No one could reduce my value or limit my potential, unless I allowed them to do so. That understanding had been worth every moment of pain and uncertainty I had endured during the collapse of my marriage. The betrayal that had once seemed like the end of my world had actually been the beginning of a life I could never have imagined. While sitting at dinner tables, invisible and dismissed, standing in my office on a quiet Friday evening, reviewing foundation reports and planning for the coming week, I realized that I had achieved something more valuable than professional success or financial security. I had learned who I truly was beneath the roles and expectations others had tried to impose. The woman David had attempted to erase had not only survived, but had discovered capabilities and purposes she never could have accessed while seeking his approval. The journey from that conference room where I had signed divorce papers to this moment of clarity and purpose had been longer and more difficult than I could have anticipated, but every step had been necessary. Every challenge had contributed to the person I had become. The woman who had once accepted $15,000 and 30 days to disappear had built a life dedicated to ensuring that other people never had to feel that powerless or invisible. That was the most complete victory I could have imagined, not because it harmed those who had tried to diminish me, but because it demonstrated the futility of their attempts to define my worth or control my future. The power to determine my value had always belonged to me. I had simply needed to claim it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.